I will never forget that night. The drums echoed through the dark air long before I saw the crowd. It wasn't a celebration. It was a confrontation. A witch doctor had challenged me in front of everyone, shouting that his power was greater than the God I served. His eyes were sharp and cold, and in his hand he carried a wooden staff covered with bones and feathers. He looked at me and said I wouldn't live to see another sunrise. In that moment, I felt something deep inside me. It wasn't fear. It was conviction. I knew that if God had brought me to the Congo, it wasn't to turn back. My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm a Christian missionary from Mexico, and I've been serving in Africa for almost 5 years now. When I first felt God's calling, I never imagined it would take me this far from home. But when God calls, you don't negotiate, you just go. I came to preach in small villages, to bring food to families, and to help build churches where people could feel hope again. What I didn't know was that this place wasn't just another mission field. It was a spiritual battlefield. The story began a few weeks before that challenge. I was working with Pastor Kimba in a small village called Lutaya. We used to visit homes, pray for the sick, and help distribute supplies. One afternoon, while we were sitting under a tree eating roasted corn, he told me about a village that no one dared to visit. It's called Mwanza, he said. A powerful witch doctor lives there. Anyone who tries to preach about Jesus in that place ends up sick or dead. His voice was calm but heavy. People say he curses anyone who speaks the name of God. I didn't answer right away, but inside something was burning. It wasn't anger or pride. It was obedience. The same fire that once pushed me to leave my country was now telling me to go to that village. Carlos, I heard a voice in my heart say, that's where I want to use you. The journey took almost a full day. Dirt roads, endless mud, and a heat that felt like fire on the skin. The jeep broke down twice, and for hours we had to walk. I remember the sound of insects, the smell of the forest, and the silence that grew the closer we got. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the kind of silence that warns you something unseen is watching. When we finally reached the village, everything stopped. The air was heavy, and not even the birds were singing. The houses were made of clay and straw, and behind every door, people were staring at us. No one spoke. Pastor Kimba leaned closer and whispered, "They know we've arrived." I asked, "Who?" He looked straight ahead and said, "Mwenye." That name hit me like a cold wind. The women nearby lowered their heads when they heard it. Everyone knew who he was. Mwenye, the man who spoke with spirits, the one people feared to even mention. That night we decided to hold a small service in the open square. We set up a small speaker, played some music, and started singing. A few people came out of their homes, curious. Others stood far away, watching from the shadows. I lifted my hands and began to pray. For a moment, it felt like the whole place was listening.
Then the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in so fast that the moon disappeared. The wind rose, and from somewhere deep in the village, drums began to beat again. Slow, deep, like a warning. And then he appeared. Tall, thin, his skin marked with white symbols, his eyes wide open as if he hadn't blinked in hours. He wore a red cloak that moved with the wind. In his hand, that same staff. He walked toward us slowly, his expression calm but full of authority. When he stopped in front of me, he spoke in a rough French accent. "Your God does not rule here, foreigner." His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that pressed against my chest. I took a breath and answered, "I didn't come to show power. I came to show truth. And the truth is that Jesus is Lord, even here." For a second, he said nothing. Then he smiled, a slow, strange smile. "We'll see if your Jesus can save you tonight," he said. and turned away. The crowd began to whisper. Some people ran back to their homes. Others just stared at me, waiting to see what would happen next. We returned to the small wooden church at the edge of the village. Only 10 people stayed with us, but we prayed as if we were hundreds. The room was filled with voices crying out, asking God for protection. I could feel the floor shaking beneath my knees, but I kept praying. Kimba placed his hand on my shoulder. "Carlos," he said quietly, "this isn't a fight of flesh and blood. Be ready." My heart was pounding so fast I thought it might burst. But I knew he was right. This wasn't about me. This was something greater. Outside, the drums started again. The same rhythm, the same challenge. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked toward the center of Mwanza. The fires burned in the distance, and I could see shadows moving. My hands were shaking, but I held on to my Bible. "Lord," I whispered, "I don't understand what's coming, but I know you're with me. Don't let fear win." It was a call, a dark invitation. Inside the church, the brothers and sisters were praying in whispers, their voices trembling but steady. Some were on their knees, others held their Bibles against their chests. Pastor Kimba walked in circles, speaking softly in his native language, asking God to cover us. The oil lamp flickered on the wall, and I remember thinking that even the flame seemed afraid to move. Suddenly, the drums stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost unnatural. I looked at Kimba. He nodded once. We both knew it was time. Without speaking, we opened the church door. The warm night air hit my face, heavy with smoke and humidity. Far in the distance, small fires burned near the center of the village. People were gathering, their shadows stretched long across the ground, moving slowly as if drawn to something powerful and unseen. I grabbed my Bible tighter and stepped outside. The others followed quietly, singing a soft hymn under their breath. When we reached the square, the crowd had already formed a wide circle. At its center stood Mwenye. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe the firelight made him look that way. His skin glistened with paint, white symbols covering his arms, chest, and face.
The red cloak hung loosely from his shoulders, and in his right hand he held the same staff. The feathers tied to it fluttered, even though the air was still. His followers surrounded him, dressed in black and red, their eyes shining with fear and fanatic devotion. None of them spoke. They simply watched. When Wenye saw me, he raised his chin. His lips curved into a faint smile. "The foreigner has come," he said in broken English. The crowd murmured. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to walk forward. I stopped a few feet away from him. The ground between us was covered with ashes from old fires. I could smell burnt wood and something else, something bitter that I couldn't identify. The witch doctor lifted his staff slowly and spoke words I did not understand. His voice echoed, deep and rhythmic. The people around him began to respond in unison, repeating his words again and again until the air vibrated with their chant. I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered a prayer. "Lord, you are the only light in this darkness. Do what you need to do tonight." When I opened them, Wenye was staring straight at me. His eyes seemed empty yet filled with rage. He shouted another phrase, and one of the men beside him fell to the ground. His body twisted violently. The people gasped. The man's eyes rolled back, and he began to scream. I could feel something cold creep up my spine. This was not a show. It was real. A dark power was moving among them. Without thinking, I raised my Bible and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "In the name of Jesus Christ, silence! My voice cracked, but it was clear. The man on the ground froze for a moment, then let out a final cry and went completely still. The crowd stepped back in shock. Some whispered that I had used stronger magic. Others simply stared. Winye glared at me, his nostrils flaring. "You think that was power?" he said, his accent thick. "Tonight you will see who rules this place." He lifted the staff again and struck it against the ground. Sparks flew from the dry earth. The fire nearby flickered, and the wind rose suddenly, twisting the flames into spirals. I could hardly breathe. The air pressed against my chest like a weight. It felt as if invisible hands were closing around my throat. My vision blurred. For a moment everything went dark. I fell to my knees. Inside, my heart was screaming, but my mouth whispered only one thing: Jesus. The sound was weak at first, almost nothing. But as soon as I said his name again, the pressure eased. My lungs filled with air, and a strange peace covered me like a blanket. I stood up slowly. "Greater is he who is in me," I said, "than he who is in the world."
I stepped forward. "This place does not belong to darkness," I said. "It belongs to God." I lifted my Bible and pressed it against my chest. This time, a flash of light burst from it, a spark that hissed like fire touching oil. The people screamed. The wind howled through the trees, scattering dust into the air. Everything spun for a few seconds. I thought I might fall, but suddenly I felt something shift. The heaviness around me lifted. The fire's light dimmed, and the sounds faded until all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then I realized something strange. The crowd was shouting, but they weren't looking at Mwinya anymore. They were looking around wildly, their faces full of confusion. Someone shouted, "Where is the foreigner?" Another voice echoed, "He's gone." My mind raced, but deep inside, I knew what was happening. God was protecting me. He was hiding me from the enemy's eyes. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to trust it. From where I stood, unseen, I watched as Mwinya turned in circles, his face twisted with confusion and anger. He shouted orders, demanding that his followers find me. They looked everywhere, pushing through the crowd, shouting my name, but I was right there among them. They could have reached out and touched me. Yet, no one did. I could feel a calm presence around me, something holy and untouchable. The Spirit of God was there, and the fear that had once gripped my heart was gone. Mwinya raised his staff again, but this time his hands shook. He shouted words in his native tongue, calling to the spirits he served. Nothing happened. He shouted louder. The crowd began to panic. One of the women screamed and ran. Another dropped to her knees, crying out to God for mercy. The fire flickered and dimmed until only a few embers glowed on the ground. I heard the Spirit whisper to my heart, clear and steady, "Be still. I will fight for you." Some of them started weeping. The air changed again. It was lighter, cleaner. Even the smell of smoke began to fade. I looked up and saw the sky clearing. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a single bright star above the trees. In that moment, I understood that God wasn't just showing his power, he was showing his mercy. Then, without warning, the wooden staff in Mwinye's hand cracked in half. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The people gasped. He looked down, terrified, as the pieces fell to the ground. A faint blue flame appeared at the base of the broken staff, burning softly before vanishing completely. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever felt. No wind, no voices, no movement, just awe. I remained invisible for a few more moments, long enough for everyone to realize that the power they had feared for years was gone.
When I finally began to feel my body again, warmth spread through me. I looked down and saw my hands reappear, faint at first, then completely visible. I stepped forward slowly. The people gasped again, whispering, pointing, unable to believe what they were seeing. I walked toward Mwenye. He was on his knees, trembling, his head bowed. For the first time, his eyes no longer held arrogance. They held fear, and something else too, desperation. He looked up at me and whispered, "What power is this?" I met his eyes and answered softly, "It's not my power. It's the power of Jesus Christ, the living God." The air was still, almost sacred. I could hear people breathing, whispering, trying to understand what had just happened. The smell of smoke hung low, and the faint blue light from the broken staff faded completely. I stood there, holding my Bible, watching Mwenye kneel in front of me. His shoulders rose and fell with each breath. His hands trembled. The same man who had cursed and mocked God hours earlier was now silent, unable to speak. The villagers stood back, afraid to move. No one dared to come close. It felt like the whole world was waiting for what would happen next. Then I heard something. It was soft at first, a sound almost like crying. Mwenye lifted his face, and I saw tears rolling down his cheeks. His voice broke as he spoke. "Why am I still alive?" he said quietly. "Your God should have killed me." I looked at him and answered the only way I knew how. Because God doesn't destroy people, He saves them. He looked at me confused. "Saves me? After everything I've done?" His words cracked with shame. I stepped closer. "Yes, even you. God kept you alive tonight to show you who He really is." "You don't understand. I've served the Spirit since I was a child. I've done terrible things. I can't be free." I looked him straight in the eyes. "You can, because Jesus already paid the price for you. If He could forgive a thief in his final moments, He can forgive you now." When I said that, he broke down completely. He covered his face with both hands and began to sob. It wasn't the cry of fear, it was the cry of someone who had been trapped for too long and had finally found a way out. I stayed quiet, praying silently, as I watched a man surrender his pride and his darkness to God. The villagers began to move closer, cautiously, as if the ground might still hold some kind of curse. But the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. The air felt clean. I could hear crickets again, something I hadn't noticed for hours. Slowly, the people surrounded us. They didn't speak, they just watched. One woman whispered, "The witch doctor is crying." A man behind her answered, "He's not a witch doctor anymore."
Those words hit me deep. Something powerful had shifted that night, something irreversible. I placed my hand on Mwenye's shoulder. "Pray with me," I said softly. He nodded. His voice trembled as he repeated after me, "Jesus, if you are real, free me." When he said that, I felt the presence of God like a wave of wind moving through the crowd. The necklaces he wore, filled with bones and charms, began to loosen and fall off one by one. The sound of breaking strings echoed like chains snapping. The people gasped. No one touched him. It was happening on its own. The cords broke, the bracelets untied, and soon he was sitting there with nothing but dust and tears on his skin. He opened his eyes and looked around, terrified at first, then relieved. "What is this feeling?" he asked. "Peace," I said. "That's peace." He nodded slowly, still in disbelief. Around us, people started crying, praying, some on their knees, others lifting their hands to heaven. I could hear voices calling out to God in different languages, but the meaning was the same: gratitude, awe, freedom. I helped Mwenye to his feet. He looked at the sky and whispered, "I served lies my whole life. I thought they gave me power, but they only took from me. Tonight I see it. Your God is real."
I smiled and said, "He's your God now too." When I said that, he began to cry again. But this time it wasn't from pain. It was joy. The kind that comes when a heart finally lets go of its chains. We stayed there for a long time, watching the fire die slowly. People came forward, asking for prayer, confessing their fear, their sins, their pain. One by one they gave their hearts to God. I had never seen anything like it. It was as if the entire village was being washed clean under the stars. Pastor Kimba stood beside me, tears streaming down his face. "Carlos," he said, "this is a miracle. We are witnessing the power of God." I could only nod. My throat was too tight to speak. I looked at the crowd, at the faces once filled with fear, now shining with light. And I knew that the darkness that ruled Mwanza had been defeated. When the prayers ended, we helped Mwenye back to the church. The 10 people who had prayed with us earlier were waiting. They embraced him without hesitation. No one cared who he had been before. Inside that small wooden building, under the flickering light of a single lamp, we sang together. Mwenye didn't know the words, but he tried to hum along. His voice was rough, but every sound he made felt pure. After the song, he stood up and said, "I want to tell my people what happened. They need to know that the spirits they fear are nothing compared to your God."
The next morning, something changed. I heard it before I even opened my eyes. Birds. Something so simple that I hadn't heard since I arrived. The village was alive again. The same place that had been silent with oppression was now filled with the sound of life. People walked openly in the streets, women smiled, men greeted one another. Even the animals seemed calmer. It was as if the entire land had taken a deep breath. The transformation wasn't just spiritual. It was physical. You could see it everywhere. Later that day, Mwenye came to me with a small wooden cross he had carved. He handed it to me and said, "This is for you. I made it last night after we prayed. I want to remember what God did for me, and I want you to remember it too." I took it from his hands and said, "I'll never forget." He smiled shyly. "I don't know how to preach like you," he said, "but I'll tell everyone what happened. I'll tell them how Jesus set me free." I told him, "That's all the preaching anyone needs to hear." That evening, we held another service. This time, the entire village came. The square was filled with people standing shoulder to shoulder. Mwenye stood at the front with me. He lifted his hands and prayed in his own language. His voice carried across the crowd, strong and clear. When he finished, he looked at everyone and said, "I was lost, but now I am found. This is what victory looks like." I asked him, "How did you find the strength to face this darkness?" He smiled and answered, "The power of darkness has no chance where faith stands." "Lord," he said, "you took me from death to life. Do the same for my people. Fill every home with your spirit." The crowd responded with amens that echoed into the night. I stood there watching, and tears filled my eyes again. The same man who once cursed the name of God was now calling on him with love. I realized that this was what true transformation looked like. Not just words, but a new life, a complete change. When the singing stopped, we all sat down around the fire. Mwenye looked at the flames and said quietly, "I used to fear the night. I thought the darkness owned it. But now I see that even the night belongs to God." His words made everyone silent. The firelight danced on their faces. Some smiled, others wept. In that moment, I knew this story would never end here. It would spread. It would reach other villages, other hearts. Because when God moves, no one can stop him. That night, I lay in my small bed inside the church and stared at the ceiling. My body was tired, but my spirit was awake. I could still hear the people singing softly outside. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for showing me that faith isn't about power or fear. It's about your presence."
Then, in the quiet, I heard his voice again, the same voice that had spoken to me before. This is only the beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever seen. News of what happened in Wanza spread faster than we could travel. Within a week, people from neighboring villages began arriving. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation. They wanted to see the place where the witch doctor had surrendered to God. I saw people walking for miles, carrying small bundles of food and water, their children on their backs, their eyes filled with questions and hope. Many of them had heard of Mugenye their entire lives. They came expecting to find fear. Instead, they found peace. The first morning after the miracle, Mugenye stood outside the church waiting for the sun to rise. I joined him. The air was cool and the sound of birds filled the sky. He looked at me and smiled. "Every morning," he said, "I used to offer blood to the spirits. Now I offer prayer." He knelt down, closed his eyes, and began to pray in his own language. I couldn't understand every word, but I could feel the meaning. Gratitude, humility, awe. When he finished, he said, "This peace I feel, I never knew it existed. For years I feared the night, but now I wait for the morning." I told him, "That is what freedom feels like." He nodded, still looking at the rising sun. "Then I never want to lose it." In every home, Mugenye told his story. He spoke simply, without pride or exaggeration. He told them how he had once served darkness and how God had saved him. People listened in silence. Some cried. Some couldn't believe what they were hearing. One old man took my hand and said, "If God can forgive him, maybe he can forgive me too." Those words broke me. That is exactly why we were there. By the end of the week, the small wooden church could no longer hold the crowd. We built benches outside and tied palm leaves for shade. Every night the sound of worship filled the village. The drums that once called the spirits were now used to praise God. The same rhythms, the same instruments, but now they carried a new meaning. Every beat was a declaration that the light had conquered the darkness. People sang until late into the night, and sometimes I would just stand there listening, letting the sound wash over me. One night, after the service, a woman came forward holding a small child in her arms. The boy was limp, barely breathing. She was crying. "Please," she said, "pray for him. The healer said he would not survive the night." I looked at the child. His skin was pale, his body weak. I laid my hand on his forehead and prayed quietly, "Lord, you brought life to this village. Bring life to this child." For a few moments, nothing happened. Then the boy opened his eyes. He coughed once, twice, and began to cry. The mother gasped and fell to her knees, sobbing. The crowd erupted in praise. I looked at Mugenye. His eyes were wide, full of wonder. He whispered, "He did it again."
I nodded. Yes, he did. Day after day, lives were changing. The same people who once hid behind locked doors now walked freely in the streets. Children laughed without fear. The entire village was different. One afternoon, while we were resting under a tree, Pastor Kemba turned to me and said, "Carlos, do you realize what has happened here?" I smiled and said, "A miracle." He shook his head gently. "More than that. Revival. This is not just one story. This is the beginning of something greater." His words stayed in my mind.
I could feel it too. God wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Soon word reached a nearby town called Tafari. The people there were known for their devotion to ancestral spirits. When they heard that Mwanza had turned to Christ, they sent a message. It said only one sentence: "If your God is real, come and show us." When I read it, I felt the same fire I had felt the day I first heard about Mwanza. I showed it to Kimba and Mwenye. Both of them looked at me in silence. Finally, Mwenye said, "We should go." I agreed. The journey to Tafari took 2 days on foot. We walked through forests, crossed muddy rivers, and slept under the stars. During the trip, Mwenye spoke little. I could tell he was nervous. "Do you think they will believe me?" he asked. I said, "You don't need them to believe you. You only need to tell them the truth." He nodded and smiled faintly. "The truth set me free. Maybe it will free them too." When we arrived in Tafari, the village was larger than Mwanza. More people, more houses, more eyes watching us. The elders greeted us with suspicion. They had heard the stories, but didn't know what to believe. Mwenye stood before them, his voice calm and strong. "I know what it means to live in fear," he said. "But I also know what it means to be free. The same God who found me in darkness is here tonight." The crowd listened quietly. Some whispered among themselves. Others stared at him, searching for proof. Then a young girl was brought forward. She couldn't speak, couldn't hear. Her mother held her tightly, tears in her eyes. One man shouted, "Prove it! If your God is real, let him help her." My heart raced. I knelt beside the girl. She looked at me but said nothing. I whispered, "You are not forgotten. God sees you." Then I prayed, "Father, not for my name, but for yours, show them that you are alive." I placed my hand gently on the girl's head. For a moment, nothing changed. Then she blinked. Her eyes moved. She turned toward her mother and whispered one word, "Mama."
The entire village fell silent. The mother collapsed, sobbing. The girl spoke again, louder this time, "Mama!" The crowd erupted. People shouted, cried, fell to their knees. Mwenye dropped to his knees, whispering prayers of thanks. The same man who had challenged us covered his face with his hands and said, "Your God is real." And from that day, Tafari was never the same. We stayed there for several weeks, teaching, praying, and helping the new believers. At night, we sat around the fire listening to the sounds of the forest. Mwenye often spoke to the people. His words were simple, but full of power. "I was a prisoner," he said, "but God broke my chains. He can break yours too." Every time he spoke, more people came forward to pray. It was as if his story carried a weight that words alone could not explain. It wasn't just what he said, it was who he had become. One evening, after everyone had gone to sleep, I walked to the edge of the village. The moon was bright and the air was cool. I looked up at the sky and thought about everything that had happened. From the first day in Mwanza to this moment, God had turned fear into faith, hate into love, darkness into light. I realized that miracles weren't only about power, they were about mercy. Every person who had witnessed what happened wasn't just seeing God's strength, they were seeing His compassion. He wasn't just showing that He was greater than evil, He was showing that He loved His people enough to fight for them. I closed my eyes and prayed, "Lord, Thank you for letting me see this. Thank you for letting me be part of it. But don't let this stay here. Let it spread." When I finished praying, I felt peace again. The same peace I had felt that night when God made me invisible. A peace that said He was still in control. Before leaving Tafari, we built another small church. It wasn't much, just wood and straw, but it was enough. The people promised to keep meeting, to keep praying. Mwenye helped raise the cross above the door. When it was done, he stood back and said, "The spirits told me once that this land belonged to them. Now it belongs to God." His words made everyone cheer. We walked away that day knowing that a fire had started in the heart of the Congo, a fire that no darkness could extinguish. And deep inside, I knew this was still only the beginning. Weeks passed and the movement kept growing. What started in one small village had now reached several others. The people of Tafari began visiting Mwanza to learn, to pray, and to share what God had done for them. Everywhere we went, we saw faces that once carried fear, now glowing with hope. It was something you could feel in the air, like the wind had changed direction. The same land that had been covered in darkness for generations was now filled with life. Every morning, Mwenye and I would walk through the village, praying for the families and helping rebuild homes that had fallen apart over the years. He had become a different man.
The once proud and feared witch doctor now carried a Bible everywhere he went. He spent hours reading it, even though he struggled with some of the words. When he didn't understand a verse, he would ask me to explain. Sometimes we sat under the same tree where the drums once called the spirits, and he would say, "This was the place where I used to bring curses, but now it's where I learned the word of God." I would look at him and smile. It was hard to believe he was the same man. One afternoon while we were resting, a young man approached us. He was nervous, his hands shaking. "I used to serve under you," he said to Mwenye. "I carried your staff and helped with the rituals. Now that you have changed, what should I do?" Mwenye looked at him and said, "You should follow the one who set me free. The spirits you served were never your masters. They were your chains." The young man began to cry. He knelt down, asking for prayer. As we prayed for him, I saw peace settle over his face. Later he said, "I feel lighter." Mwenye smiled and told him, "That's because you finally dropped what you were never meant to carry." Women who had been afraid to step outside at night now walked freely, singing hymns. Children who used to hide when they heard drums now danced in the open. The transformation was complete. It was as if the whole land had been washed clean by the hand of God. One morning I woke up early and walked to the edge of the river. The mist hung low over the water, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I sat on a rock and thought about everything that had happened since I arrived in the Congo. I remembered the fear I felt that first night in Mwanza, the sound of the drums, the challenge of the witch doctor, the miracle that followed. I remembered the faces of the people, the cries, the prayers, the light breaking through the darkness. And I realized that what had happened wasn't just about one village or one miracle. It was about something much greater. God was showing me that faith wasn't limited by borders, languages, or traditions. His presence could reach anywhere, even the places that seemed forgotten. As I sat there, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Kimba. He sat down next to me and said, "You've been quiet lately." I nodded. "I've been thinking," I said. "When I left Mexico, I thought I was coming here to preach, but I think God brought me here to learn." Kimba smiled. "Learn what?" I looked at the river. "That faith is not about words. It's about surrender. You can't talk about light unless you've stood in the dark. And I've stood there.
He nodded slowly. Yes. And you've seen what happens when light enters the dark. I smiled. Exactly. I still remember the face of an old woman who could barely walk, insisting on being baptized. When she came out of the water, she lifted her hands and said, "I can feel him. I can feel his love." Tears streamed down her face, and everyone began to praise. Mwenye was there too, standing beside me, helping each person as they entered the water. When it was over, he looked at me and said, "I never thought I'd see this day." I told him, "Neither did I, but God did." I thought about the people who would soon go to other villages carrying this same message. It made me think of how small one person is and how big God's plan can be. He had taken a small mission, something simple, and turned it into something far beyond what I could imagine. A few days later, a messenger arrived from a distant region. He carried a letter written in French. It said that there was another village where the people wanted to hear about what was happening in Wanza and Tafari. They had heard stories about a man who once served darkness and now preached about light. They wanted to see it for themselves. I showed the letter to Mwenye. He read it slowly, then looked at me. "We should go," he said. I could see determination in his eyes. The same fire that once burned for the wrong purpose now burned for truth. "If God did it for me," he said, "He can do it for them." They had heard the stories but didn't know what to believe. Mwenye stood before them, his voice calm and strong. "I know what it means to live in fear," he said, "but I also know what it means to be free. The same God who found me in darkness is here tonight." Others confessed that they had called on spirits for help, but found only emptiness. Every night we prayed until our voices were gone, and one by one the people began to change. I could see it in their eyes. They were beginning to understand what freedom truly meant. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned dark, and rain began to fall heavily. The people ran to their homes for shelter, but we stayed outside under a small canopy, praying. The wind blew hard, bending the trees. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the sky for a moment. In that brief light, I saw Mwenye standing in the rain, his hands lifted, his face turned toward heaven. His voice rose above the storm. "Lord, this is your land. Let every drop of rain wash away the fear that once ruled it. Let your spirit fall like rain upon your people." His words carried through the storm, and I felt something powerful move through that place. The rain didn't stop, but the fear did. The storm that had come to frighten them had become the sound of freedom. When morning came, the sky was clear. The rain had washed everything clean. The earth smelled fresh, the trees glistened, and the air felt new. The people came out of their homes smiling, laughing. They said the rain brought peace. And they were right. It wasn't just the weather. It was a sign, a new beginning. As we prepared to leave that village, the chief came to us. He was an older man, tall and thin, with a deep voice. "I have lived many years," he said, "and I have seen many things, but never this. I once believed the spirits ruled this land. Now I know there is a greater power. Your God is real." He handed me a carved wooden bowl. "Take this," he said. "It's a gift from our people to yours, a reminder that light can reach even the darkest corners." I took it, humbled. "Thank you," I said. "We will never forget you." That night, as we reached Mwanza again, I looked up at the same sky where it had all begun. The stars looked exactly as they did that first night, but everything else had changed. The fear was gone. The silence was gone. In its place, songs of praise rose from every home. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. You did it." And in my heart, I knew this was not the end of the story.
It was the continuation of something eternal. Time passed, but the memories never left me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the faces of the people in Mwanza, the place where everything began. It had been months since that first night when I faced Mwenye, but every day still felt like a new chapter of the same miracle. The small church that once held 10 people now overflowed with hundreds. There was laughter in the streets, songs rising from the hills, and joy that could not be silenced. The Congo, once heavy with fear, now carried the sound of life. Every morning I woke before sunrise and walked through the village. I watched people gather in small groups, reading the Bible together, praying, sharing stories of what God had done for them. Sometimes I would hear children playing near the river, their voices echoing across the valley. It was hard to believe that this was the same place that once trembled under the weight of darkness. The same drums that once called spirits now led songs of worship. And in the center of it all stood Mwenye, no longer a symbol of fear, but a living testimony of God's mercy. He had changed completely. His eyes that once carried anger now held peace. He walked through the village with kindness, helping the poor, comforting the sick, and teaching anyone who would listen. I often found him sitting outside the church, surrounded by children, telling them about the God who had set him free. One day, I asked him, "Do you ever think about who you were before?"
He smiled softly. "Sometimes," he said, "but not with shame. When I remember my past, I don't see who I was. I see who God is. Every mistake I made only shows how great His mercy is." Those words stayed with me. They reminded me that grace is not about what we deserve, but about who He is. As the months went by, more missionaries began to arrive. Some came from other parts of Africa, others from across the world. They had heard about what was happening in the Congo and wanted to be part of it. We welcomed them with open arms. Together, we built new churches, schools, and wells for clean water. We trained local leaders to continue the work when we moved on. What had started with one confrontation between light and darkness had become a movement of transformation that no one could stop. One afternoon, while we were working on a new church in a nearby village, I saw a group of people walking toward us. Among them was a man I didn't recognize at first. He was tall, thin, and walked with a limp. When he got closer, I realized it was the young man who once carried Mwenye's staff. His face was different now. His eyes were bright, and his smile wide. He said, "I came to help. I want to build this church." I asked him how he had been. He said, "Free, truly free." He looked around and added, "I used to build altars for the dead. Now I want to build houses for the living." I couldn't hold back my tears. That moment was proof that what God begins, He completes. Later that evening, I sat by the fire with Kimba and Mwenye. The night was calm. The stars shone bright over the horizon. We didn't speak for a while. The silence was peaceful, filled with the sound of the wind through the trees. Finally, Kimba said, "Do you realize how much has changed?" I looked at the two men beside me. "Yes," I said, and it all began with one act of obedience. Mwenye nodded, and one act of mercy. We stayed there, watching the fire burn low, knowing that we were part of something far greater than ourselves. Days turned into weeks, and soon it was time for me to return home. I didn't want to leave, but I knew God was calling me to go back and share what I had seen. The night before my departure, the entire village gathered in the square. The same place where fear once ruled was now filled with music and celebration.
The people brought gifts, fruit,
handmade crafts and letters written in their native tongue. One of the elders stood up and said, "You came here as a stranger, but you leave as a brother. This land will always carry your footprints." I couldn't stop the tears that filled my eyes. I told them, "This isn't goodbye, it's only the beginning. What God started here will never end. Wherever I go, I will carry his name." Mwenye walked up to me. His eyes were wet with tears. "Brother," he said, "you saved my life." I shook my head. "No," I said, "God did. I was just here to witness it." He smiled. "Then I will spend the rest of my life being a witness too." I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't need me anymore. You have everything you need right here." He smiled. "Yes, I have him." I hugged him tightly. "Never forget," I said, "the same God who made you invisible that night is the same God who now makes you seen." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will never forget." The next morning, I packed my few belongings and climbed into the Jeep. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The church stood tall, the cross shining in the sunlight. People waved from the road. Children ran after the Jeep, laughing. The sound of their joy filled my heart. I whispered, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for letting me see your glory." And as the village disappeared behind me, I felt a deep peace settle inside my soul. I knew that my time there had changed me forever. I had come to teach, but I was the one who had learned the most. I had learned that true faith is not about seeing miracles, it's about trusting the one who performs them. When I returned to Mexico, I told my story everywhere I went. Some believed immediately, others listened in silence, unsure if such things could still happen. But I didn't argue or try to convince them. I simply said, "I was there, I saw it, and I know God is still alive." Over time, more people began to believe. They realized that the power of God is not limited by time or place. It's real, it's present, and it still transforms lives today. And every time I tell the story, I make sure to end it the same way. It wasn't my power that defeated the witch doctor. It was the name that is above every name, Jesus Christ. The man who once served darkness now shines light into every corner he enters. His life has become a living sermon, one that speaks louder than any words ever could. And I know that someday, when my time on this earth ends, I will see him again, standing among the people he led to God, all worshiping together in the eternal light. Even now, when I kneel to pray, I can still hear the voices of Mwanza, the laughter, the songs, the sound of faith rising like a wave through the forest. I remember the drums, not as instruments of fear, but as echoes of victory. I remember the fire that once burned in the darkness, now burning in every heart that believes. And I realized that what happened there was never just a story. It was a message for the world, a message that says, God still reigns, He still saves, He still performs the impossible. If you're hearing this story, know this. It wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't magic. It was grace. The same grace that reached into the heart of the Congo can reach into your life too. Maybe your battle isn't against a witch doctor. Maybe it's against fear, sickness, addiction, or doubt. But whatever it is, the same God who protected me, who made me invisible, who broke the chains of a man lost in darkness, is the same God who can set you free. He hasn't changed. His power is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So don't let fear define you. Don't let the enemy convince you that your story is over. It's not. If you're still breathing, God is still working. The miracle that happened in that village was not the end. It was a reminder that no matter how far the darkness reaches, light will always win. If this story touched your heart, don't stay silent. Write in the comments, "I believe in the power of God." because every time you declare your faith, someone else finds theirs. Share this video with a friend who needs to be reminded that God still moves mountains. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel where real miracles are told, because this is just one of many stories that prove His power is alive. God bless you, and remember, where faith is spoken, miracles begin.